All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Macknick. I'm one of the developers here at BioRAFT, and welcome to Drupal Nights hosted by BioRAFT. We appreciate you coming, and we host this event once a month, and really great to see the turnout and all the different discussions that we have. And really excited about the one that we have today, CiviCRM. David Tarrant's going to talk about CiviCRM, integrating that with Drupal. Very, very powerful. It'll be very interesting, I think, to learn some of the things about what you can do with CiviCRM, and like I said, it's very powerful. We have a great presentation tonight, so I'll turn it over to David right now. Thanks, David.
All right, thanks, Mike. Thank you all, thanks for coming. Thanks to BioRAFT for this session, as well as all the other ones that you guys do. I think it's really pretty special for the, you want me on the camera?
Yeah.
It's a pretty special set of events, and I know I've learned a lot. I hope I can share some of the things that I know today. As you all know, we're going to talk about Drupal and CiviCRM. If you came here for my Bitcoin presentation, this is the time to leave. Probably one of the few people in the world who alternate CiviCRM presentations with Bitcoin presentations.
Yay.
Somewhere along the way, we're going to figure out how to collect Bitcoin. I think actually there may be a CiviCRM extension for Bitcoin, so I probably have to look into that as well. I have a lot of material to cover, okay? And I'm going to do my best to get through it in an hour. I'm going to spend maybe the first half on CiviCRM and its functionality, the second half on Drupal, and then in the integration. And then the third half, as our friends over at the auto shop talk about the third half of the program. So we'll do that with questions and answers. So lots of slides. I'm doing this as not a walkthrough. These will be a series of slides, screenshots, in order to work with the video and what have you, and it simplifies things a little bit. My background is the software industry. I've done a lot of startups over the years, and come from the commercial side of the world to the nonprofit and open source side of the world. And my confession is that the shops and things that we've done in the past were all Microsoft shops. So I'm a recent convert to the open source world, and like all converts, you become zealots, and I've certainly done that. This is an old guy trick. I just wanted to point out to you folks that what you do when you're an old guy is you wear a hat, right? When you have your picture taken. That may be the obvious part so that gray hair doesn't show. But in fact, the more subtle part is actually, if you get the light just right, the shadow kind of hides the crow's feet and things like that. So it may come in handy someday in terms of what's going on there. I also learned something today, and I'd like to share it with you because I'm a big believer in trying to learn something new every day. And I credit Michelle and BioRAFT for this, that there's some interesting presenter tips that they point you to, and I thought I'll go take a look at them. And one of them, which I'd never heard of before, is that if you press W in a PowerPoint presentation, it goes to a white screen. I've done PowerPoint presentations for years and years and years, so if you don't get anything else out of it tonight, and if you press B, you know what happens?
Black.
Let's test it out. You get the black screen.
Awesome.
Pretty cool, okay? So, no matter what happens, it'll be good night. So Nube is a nonprofit, 501c3 nonprofit that I started a little over 2 years ago with a mission to help nonprofits with technology using open source applications, cloud hosted, and supported by Nube and tech savvy volunteers. And I will hit up everybody before the night is out for any interest in volunteering in terms of what's going on. Driven by a couple of things. One is nonprofit organizations classically have a difficult time with technology. They don't have the budgets, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the time, they're intimidated, they certainly can't compete for talent with commercial organizations that can pay the big bucks and what have you. So there's an enormous need there. What I learned as I dug into this a couple of years ago is that there's a lot of really great open source applications. And I think everybody in this room certainly knows that. Drupal is clearly one of the foremost in that category. I'll talk a lot about CiviCRM, but it's not limited to just those. But there's this technical chasm in between the people who could use these things and, in fact, the open source applications themselves. And as I got involved in this is the kind of stuff that I saw. And I really found this, really? You gotta be kidding me. And yet, this is what you're faced with if you're a normal person and you're trying to use an open source application. Yeah, there's a lot of ways around it and different things like that. But too often, this is what someone would bump into. Yet, on the other side of this chasm, you've got things that look like Salesforce once it's installed, or take your pick. Basically, you've got drop-down menus, you've got forms you can fill out. It actually looks like, in my world, historically normal software, but you just got to get it in, okay? And so Nube has taken on as its mission, really, to bridge that chasm for the nonprofits and to help as many of them as we can. So we've got some fairly aggressive and significant goals. And really, I ask you to imagine a world or system whereby we had a comprehensive platform with an integrated suite of applications that addresses the primary operating applications required by nonprofits. It's a big mouthful, okay? And there's quite a few things that people can use. We're going to focus tonight on Drupal and CiviCRM and what they do, but there's a lot of other things, whether it be financial or otherwise, that are excellent applications in the open source world that can benefit from this approach. This suite will be fully maintained, upgraded, and supported. It's not, here it is, and we're going to head out. We're going to maintain it and keep it going and upgrade as necessary. Improvements will be continuous and broad-based, which is really the purpose of the community that develops open source applications, and the range of functionality that's added over time is obvious to everybody here. Platforms cloud hosted, accessible by anyone, anywhere, whether that be the users at the nonprofits, the volunteers who want to help them regardless of geography or what have you. Obvious kinds of things. No licensing fees for this platform, and in cost, if you look at the hosting cost, less than the cost of a single cell phone on a monthly basis. No. So effectively, we're talking about something that has the potential to disrupt significantly in the nonprofit world the kinds of things that people are doing and spending a lot of money on it. I'm not going to use that chair, so feel free. So there's a potential, if that description of the system is implemented in a way that I believe is possible, to do some significant disruption of the commercial enterprises, frankly, that are making a lot of money off the nonprofits who can benefit from other things that are out there. Just a question of putting it together, making all the things work, and getting it to them. I believe in one thing. You guys seen City Slickers? You must. If you haven't, you should. We didn't try this part. I need to hook it into the speaker, can I? How many people have seen City Slickers? Goes back probably 20 years now, I think, in terms of what's going on. My voiceover won't be quite as effective as Curly's. Basically, Curly tells Billy Crystal here in that you got to figure out what's the one thing. And Billy Crystal says, what's the one thing? And he says, that's what you got to figure out. Prior to that, he says, and if you know the one thing, if you figure that out, all the rest don't mean shit. So, unfortunately, I'm sorry that that didn't quite work the way it would be if you're sitting right over here now. We can gather around that later. Okay. For the main event, CMS, content management, and CRM. Like peanut butter and chocolate. These are two things that really, really, really belong together. Your database and your website. Again, pretty obvious, but not that easy to do and not that often integrated in terms of what's going on. So I'm going to talk about what's all about there. I think there's a paradox out there, and it's been obvious to me as I've traveled around meetups and what have you in the open source world, that open source can be cheaper and better. A lot of people zero in, particularly I know in the nonprofit world, and they say we want to use CiviCRM because it's cheap, or if they know about it, or they immediately latch on to the cost factor in terms of what's going on. Strong believer that better is much more important. Cheap is wonderful, free is wonderful, all those great things. But if you can't come up with a better solution, people aren't going to be happy. And so the integration that you'll see and that we can do with these is dramatic and frankly blows people away when they see it. Development cost obviously drives the cost down in terms of what's going on. Support can be cheaper too when you utilize the community, when you utilize volunteers, when you utilize the body of knowledge that's actually out there. An observation that is one that has repeated itself over time, many, many times, is that when you're talking about application software, the battlegrounds among vendors typically start with feature wars, and everybody goes up the curve and ultimately starts hitting a peak in terms of what they can do. And classically what happens is that integrated solutions then become the battleground in terms of what's going on and who can bring together more pieces and more functionality. So the next level is there in terms of outflanking people that are there. That chart that I showed you has occurred over and over again, going way, way back in the productivity software world that I'm familiar with in the olden days. You had things like Microsoft Excel and Word and Access and PowerPoint, things like that, that were all competing with single point applications. When Microsoft put them all together, they outflanked everybody and basically took over with Microsoft Office the marketplace. And it's happened with others. In the nonprofit space, I can see it happening now, or potentially happening now, when you look at donor management types of things like Donor Perfect, Razor's Edge, GiftWorks, things that some people in the room may be familiar with, but things that the nonprofit world sees all the time and is struggling to decide what to use with what's out there. Certainly there's Drupal versus WordPress versus other content management systems. In the email space, you've got Constant Contact, MailChimp, ExactTarget, Responses, all these things which are really isolated, siloed solutions with API integrations and what have you, but represent individual applications. What I'm going to show you tonight and what we've done with Nube is call it a platform. I would call it a platform in terms of what's happening, but basically this is, we're using Amazon's web services. We've got the LAMP stack in terms of what's going on there, and then we've got Civi and Drupal as the core applications, and then modules that integrate Civi with Drupal, and I'm going to show you very specifically some of those that are there. But as a result of the functionality of each of these products and the integration modules, there's an awful lot going on. Yeah, there's a website out there, and we can do donor management, and we can manage, and we've got email and workflows and whatever. But then you start seeing things that the integration brings you, forms, completion web forms, doing surveys, and the way views work, and things like that, and taking it further into knowledge management, VoIP applications, and whatever. So, an extraordinary range of applications that are a result and capabilities a result of the individual products, but even more so what can be done when they're put together. In fact, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Nube is zeroing in on Drupal and Civi because of all these things, but we're beginning and have done some looking at other open source applications which have the benefit of running on the same platform. So again, if you're supporting the platform and it's there and it's got the LAMP stack and it's configured and ready to run, well, why not add a ticketing system for trouble ticketing for those organizations that might need that? We're running an Asterisk voice over IP system on the same platform. And then you get into other open source applications that one can bring on there. This is sort of projecting out, but in each of these cases you do see different levels of integration that are very, very powerful in terms of what's going on. We've got some things in the VoIP space that we're investigating that we think are really interesting in terms of bringing another level of capability to the table. So the demonstration, which as I said is a screenshot demonstration that I'm going to get to right now, is to basically talk first about Civi and how it's more than CRM, and I'll give you a lot of illustrations of what's going on there, and then I'll show examples of the Civi and Drupal integration, and then lastly, in the nonprofit space, an example of this which brings outcomes measurement and management to the nonprofit space, which is a very important hot button in the nonprofit space. So. I will go through a lot of stuff fast. I'm doing it fast right now. Please feel free to stop and ask questions, and I'll be happy to answer both now and as we go forward. How many have used Civi in some fashion or another already? So maybe half of the group have used it. Civi, the way I like to describe it is that Civi lives within Drupal. Civi made what I think is a brilliant architectural decision, 10 years ago or whatever they got started. Maybe it was for practical reasons, but I'd like to believe it was really they could see where the future was. But Civi uses Drupal as well as WordPress or Joomla in the open source space as the presentation layer for the product. So effectively what happens is that Civi is living within Drupal and benefits by all the growth and functionality that Drupal brings to the table. And that by itself means that Civi is growing at a rapid pace and can do things that other CRM solutions can't do as easily, and what have you. And so it's a little bit small up here, but I think you can see the basically Drupal admin menu there, and then the Civi menu is by virtue of the installation of the Civi module, becomes a menu choice in Drupal. When that's selected, we flip to the CiviCRM menu set. I'll show you the examples of what's going on in there. And we're now looking at the Civi homepage and the Civi presentation for a Civi administrator. But I think, as most people will recognize, that that's a Drupal theme that's still at work there. It doesn't have to be the same theme that is used by the website. It could be, but you can set up an administrator's theme, which is maybe uses less space for external promotional purposes and more make real estate available for someone who's working, as an administrator inside and other kinds of things. Yet, if Civi uses, or if you use a Civi page for, let's say, a registration for an event, you can have the public theme used for that. So you can identify when you configure Civi within Drupal what theme to actually use for Civi public pages. So it does a lot of really, really smart things in terms of things that you find when you're looking for them. I've found, and over the years, the test of good software is when you start looking for something, and when you find the solution to what you're doing, you're pleasantly surprised. I've been blown away over and over and over again when I find something, sometimes easy, sometimes hard, in Civi. But more often than not, I found myself saying, wow, that's a lot better than I expected to find, and it inspires me to do other kinds of things once you find it. So that's a testimony to software that I think is well architected and has been implemented consistent with that kind of an architectural approach. The next set of slides really are to give you a sense of the functionality that's in Civi. So I'm really just going to hit through a few of these things as we go past on it. So it's a full-featured contact manager. I can't do a service to all that's in there in terms of contact management, but I think it's fair to say that if someone is looking for a contact manager, is using everything from Salesforce to you name it in terms of contact management, CRM space, it's there and it's got a lot of functionality. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining that, but I think it's fair to say that it does have the kinds of things that you would expect to find in there, as well as the ability to configure them. I'll talk about customization capabilities and what have you. So if you want to work with volunteers or advisors or friends or partners, you can customize the nomenclature and other types of things to make it feel like it's part of whatever your organization is. It has a contribution management capability, a payment management capability. So if you're collecting money, whether it be in a nonprofit space for donations or payments for commerce or payments for events that you're doing, it's all handled by the contributions pages, payments pages, and they link very nicely to the various and sundry parts of the application that collect money. Payment processors can be selected, and so whether it be PayPal or Authorize.net or Stripe or what have you, there's multiple payment processors that can be hooked in and are all used consistently across all of these vehicles. And accounting batches to hand off to your QuickBooks or whatever it is that you might be using for finance and other things like that. There's an event management capability, so if you're running events, whether you're a nonprofit or not, and you want to post those events, promote them on your website, you want to register participants, collect money or not, and manage personal campaigns and a variety of other things, there's a lot there. And event management is another example of once I started using it, I found myself saying it's got an awful lot of functionality. Similar to Drupal in that way, I think, in that the good news is there's an awful lot there. The challenge is using it wisely and not getting perhaps carried away and getting too deep into it. But once you find these things and start realizing how they can be used, oftentimes it goes much further.
It's a quick question. I noticed it says import contacts and import participants on this.
Yes.
Is that just a CSV file or are there other options?
CSV is the primary option, and I do not believe there's anything that's not text or CSV. They
Okay.
have multiple variations on it, but they're all text oriented. There are extensions, and I think there's an Excel extension which may be an import directory. In fact, I'm pretty certain it is. I have not used it, but I know there are extensions. And Civi does have nowhere near, obviously, what Drupal has in terms of modules or extensions and what have you, but Civi extensions are out there, and a number of them are very functional.
Thank you.
Useful. But as you get into configuring events, and I've gotten into it, you get into an awful lot of capability. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I just want to leave you with the impression there's a lot there. It has membership management. So if you're managing members with a rotating basis or a rolling basis, and they're signing up and they're paying membership fees or not, and you want to, automatically notify them and do other kinds of things that are affiliated with the membership management, that's there too. Hard to see this here. But again, this is the kind of thing that you get in terms of range of capabilities when you're trying to configure these things that I think are quite competitive with standalone products that are there. And it goes on and on and on. You can manage campaigns. Cases I'll talk a little bit more about in terms of what they are, because they have a really intriguing set of functionality, and you can manage and track grants and reports and what have you. Export it to Excel. And then there's extensions, so here's just a few of them that are installed in this particular case. So a volunteer management, an event calendar, the event calendar integrates with Drupal, and so on. Cases are relatively new in terms of what's happening with Civi as they're being added on in. The cases are intriguing in that the functionality that was built in this architecture that I think is so terrific really has an awful lot of workflow functionality in it. A case typically is tracking a workflow over time. Someone comes on an intake process, and maybe they have to be evaluated. Maybe they have to go for a medical evaluation. Maybe then there's a housing support person that brings in. So you can imagine what a workflow might be like. Cases have a lot of workflow functionality that can be sequenced, can be assigned to individuals, so it takes the CRM capability and says, okay, here are individuals, and individuals can be given roles, and then roles can be assigned to components of this workflow in terms of what's going on, and you can have a timeline and how long it takes, and the status and notifications and what have you. So Cases, while has a a nonprofit social services flavor to it, when I look at it and look at what's going on and how it's built in, an awful lot of it feels like it could be used for a lot of different types of workflows once someone starts thinking about that.
Yeah. So a couple of Drupal meetups ago was hosted at Pega Systems.
Right.
And they have 3 floors. There's huge, huge space. And their core product is proprietary. And all it is based around cases.
Cases.
I think they even call it that. But it's exactly what you're saying. Like, you can do everything with how
Yeah.
you handle workflow.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
their whole product. And then they're like, doing some Drupal front end sites
Just
as
started-
a whole
yeah.
separate thing. But yeah, that's
Just started scratching the surface of this in terms of thinking about ways that it can be used. And there's a capability that gets real interesting. Again, more information about looking at an individual's cases and what their workload might be and who's it going to next and whatever. So you start seeing things like that, pull the pieces together logically. I'm going to come back to cases and some of the things that actually supercharge a lot of this stuff. A lot of reports functionality in here of various types. I don't think this is a strong suit of Civi, by the way, but there is a lot of customization capabilities and there's a lot of standard reports. How many know what a Libont is? Anybody?
A cake. No.
It's a nonprofit thing, it's been around forever, okay? It means last year but not this year. So
Oh.
a donor who gave last year but not this year. It's an important thing. If you're a nonprofit,
It is.
that's one of your lifebloods, okay? You get to the end of the year, what are you doing? Anybody want to guess what a SIBONT is? See how smart this group is? Some year, but not this year. So gave once, but haven't given this year in terms of what's going on. But so there are things which are really good for nonprofits in there, but a lot of the reports are really CRM-like reports or other kinds of things of that type. Enormous amount of customization, dangerously amount of customization. Again, probably like Drupal in that regard in terms of what's happening. Well, a couple of things I want to mention, and a lot of these modules or whatever you might want to call them can be enabled or disabled in terms of whether or not you really care to have those things hanging around with people. Activity types is one of the things, I don't have a slide on that particularly, but you can create whatever activities you want. So let's say it's a medical evaluation could be an activity, again, thinking about the cases. So you start building out your workflow by defining what are the activities, okay? So maybe, again, it's an intake into social services, but maybe it's, get a resume and then process the resume and approve and hand it on to somebody else. So you can build out a set of activities, and then they're all available for the case functionality or this workflow functionality. So even though activities also show up, whether it be a CRM activity, make a phone call, do this or do that, in a number of other ways in terms of what's happening. How are we doing on time?
7:30.
Okay, I may pick it up a little bit. Custom data, plenty of that. Relationships is really another interesting capability that can be built on. So you can define relationships. Obvious ones are, spouse of, employee of, things like that that are built in. But you can build other relationships between individual to an individual or individual to an organization and what have you. So you start seeing things like maybe Genius 4, okay? Genius is a term that Nube uses that says, okay, a volunteer who's assigned to a nonprofit would be the genius for that nonprofit. It's shamelessly stealing from Apple's notations in terms of what's going on. But then if you go into the CRM solution and say, who's the genius for this organization? Well, there it is, and it's other individuals or people, whoever. Those relationships are also quite interesting in terms of what, okay, here's an example. Health services coordinator is so-and-so. Again, a relationship that's built in order to be used with those cases or workflows or things like that. Yeah, and the way it actually builds them out is you're creating labels A to B, B to A, and then what's the contact type? Is it an individual, a household, an organization, and is it connected to another organization? So employee of would be an individual to an organization, and employed by would go the other way when you see them in terms of what's happening there. In the CRM world, in a lot of worlds, the 360-degree view of an individual is what is used by a lot of organizations to promote what they're doing. This thing is spectacular. So here's a demo person in the CRM space in Civi, and what you get across the top for this individual is contributions. If I bring the contributions out, it would show you all the money that has been paid, whether it be a donation, a payment for an event, payment for membership. So the history of contributions is all right there. What events this person has participated at. You click on that, you see which events they belong to. All the activities ranging from emails sent, phone calls, case activities, whatever, they're all right there. They indicate what relationships, if it's parent of, spouse of, who are the kids that go along with that. It brings all this stuff together in a really, really incredible way, in a very natural way. I used to use Salesforce, in the prior organization, and it was nowhere near as intuitive in doing these kinds of things as Civi is. It just kind of flows pretty naturally in terms of what's going on. Salesforce, it just always felt like it was a struggle to sort of figure these things out. Civi, once you kind of get into it or whatever, a lot of this stuff just seems to happen very naturally. Here's a set of the activities. Yeah, so you can look at it. So an email was sent, they registered for an event, they renewed their membership, they changed the status. It's all there. You can see and you can get into those kinds of things. I mentioned relationships. I am going to fly through some of these things. Civi Mail, so there's a full-featured, and I can say it's full-featured, an organization that I was, the last company I was with, we did email marketing, and along the lines of what HubSpot does in many ways. Civi has an integrated mail capability, which, for those of you who's Constant Contact or pretty much any one of the bulk kinds of things, has all of that functionality. There's one slight difference that I'll mention that can be significant, but if you're looking for tracking, if you're looking for link tracking, if you're looking for open tracking, all those kinds of things, you can manage all those things there. But it has the tremendous advantage, which is different than you get with almost any other bulk email capability, short of APIing between Salesforce and what have you, is that you've got the CRM database at your disposal when you're creating a mailing. So rather than dump a list, upload it to Constant Contact, and then say, oh, I've got first name, last name, but I really wish I had job title, or whatever else piece of information in the database. It's all right there, and I didn't show the capabilities, but if you can define groups and do things like that, and you can say, I want to include individuals, I'm going to exclude the groups that are major donors defined by those people who gave more than $1,000, whatever you do there. And so right there at your disposal, as you are building out your email campaign, you can include or exclude things. You can say, it knows all the mailings that were done, so you can say, okay, I don't want to resend to someone who just got the last one, or maybe I do.
When you mentioned major donors being, having contributed a certain amount, is that actually a dynamic group, or is that one that's maintained by hand?
It can be, in this case, it's a dynamic group. Civi allows you to do both. So you can have static groups if you want them to be static. You can also have dynamic, they call them smart groups. So they are regenerated according to whatever the latest data might be. And there's some good stuff in there in terms of doing that. Yeah, and that applies to lots of different types of groups. So any type of search criteria that you do can be turned into a group or a smart group, and then use that repeatedly going forward. So you can have all of the information that's available, including a lot of custom fields and things like that that you build in to say you want to collect that's in there.
Does it do batch mailing or?
Yeah, it is batch, yeah. Well, it does batch and trigger based, and you can actually have it do batch, but it also can do notifications and reminders and things like that based upon rules. When it comes time for your membership to be renewed, it will trigger one of those guys out there. Tracking, responding, what have you. All of the data, so tokens in an email message that customize it from all of the data that's in the database is right there when you're doing that. So again, that's the kind of thing that you want to have. Dear so-and-so, that's the easy stuff. But then you start going down, thank you for your gift of blank, last year, or whatever it turns out. All that stuff is just sitting there, and you don't have to go pull it other kinds of ways. Okay, I'm going to start moving us into the Drupal part of it in terms of what's happening. And so the platform includes, when I say platform, pre-configured modules for Drupal that we've determined and decided are worth having, as part of the 80-20 rule, as I would describe it. Themes, obviously, are integration capabilities because you're using themes back and forth. Web forms, surveys, views. Surveys are really part of that. Here are the modules that we use. And everything from web form integration, the base module itself. There's rules capabilities to integrate OG. I don't think I have it on here, but organic groups, synchronization. So you can synchronize Civi groups with organic groups in Drupal, and we're doing some crazy things like that with one of the clients that we're working with. This is a case that I quite honestly don't know why it works this way, but this is the way views integrate. So all the data that I'll show you that's available in Civi can be used in a Drupal view, which gives you all sorts of interesting capabilities. Web forms is maybe the best example for starting in terms of how well they can work together, and I'm sure a lot of people have used them in one fashion or another. So Drupal has great web forms capabilities with lots of functionality, and Civi basically has a module that says the data that's in Civi is available to your web form. So there's a web form, in this case it's Nube signing up volunteers, and the web form integration between Civi and Drupal adds the Civi tab to the Drupal web form tab for administrative functionality in terms of what's going on. If you select that tab, small print here, hopefully people can see it, but all of the fields in Civi are available by a checkbox in the web form. So if you want to build a web form, you say, I've got first name, I've got last name, I've got company, I've got relationship, I've got whatever it is, you build out your web form in Drupal, and now that form, when it's completed by someone who comes to the website and completes the web form, it's adding a Civi record and updating it with whatever information is picked up. That's powerful, and it makes it easy to say, okay, here's how I can do these things without necessarily writing code or directly connecting things. It gets better though, okay? So one of the things in the web form integration is a URL. It's probably going to cut off a little bit here. A URL here that if you take this URL and put it as an href in your Civi mail, so we're sending a mailing out to somebody, and it says, you know, click here to sign up for whatever. That, when it goes out by Civi mail, is going to format in the unique ID for the recipient of that message, and a checksum so that people can't cheat on it in terms of what's going on. So that if you click on that URL, you're going to go to the web form, and it's going to be pre-populated with what it knows about you already. So now you can say, you know, update us on what you're doing, or we'd like to get more demographic data about you. We'd like to know what you're interested in volunteering for, whatever, without having people have to sort of re-enter these things. Uses the same kind of concept for sending out a registration for an event. The registration goes out, there's a link there, it pre-populates it. If they've already been to an event, it knows everything about them, and on you go. I mean, obvious, logical stuff, but it's all there without working hard because of the way these two things work together. Yeah, here's the link. So now I'm back. If I were back setting up a link in Civi Mail, I just paste in the URL from that particular web form, and I've got my integration or automatic updating. Yeah, this is also part of web forms. So the web forms themselves include. You can tie the web form into registrations for events. You can tie it into a whole bunch of the other things. So all that stuff, a lot of the stuff that I showed you in the Civi dashboard that you can do, web forms can actually be used to collect. And it's kind of the best of both worlds in some sense, because you can use Drupal for all its great functionality for web forms, and then still get the benefit of linking it back to Civi, and Civi doesn't have to sort of continually fight the battle of how do our web forms get better and better and better in terms of what's going on. Used it for surveys, so Drupal's really good web forms for doing surveys, paging, conditionals, skip things and whatever. You get the benefit of that, so it becomes a survey tool with the survey automatically updating and connecting to the database. Views, so now Drupal views are integrated through this pasting, frankly, of all of those field references in Civi into a settings PHP file. And Drupal, again, somebody's going to explain to me someday why it was done that way. I don't know. It's probably a good reason. But now I'm in a Drupal view. I'm creating a new view. And what you're going to see here by virtue of the Civi integration is that you can create a view of all sorts of Civi capabilities. So in addition to creating a view of content that's in Drupal, as you wish, you can now say, okay, I want to show activities or contributions or groups or contacts, okay, what they might turn out to be. And now all of the Drupal view functionality can be used to operate on data. You can present the data in the view, you can filter on it, you can sort on it, you can make it live, you can do, again, stuff that is pretty impressive once you start digging in and say, how can we use this for some of these kinds of things? Yeah, here it is, where in the Drupal view, you're seeing those fields that you can select from and decide which ones you actually want to put in by, checking a slightly different box. But okay, here's a custom field, which is volunteer information, volunteer skills. So you send out a form, you collect that data, now you create a view, and you have an intranet page if you want to do that, or you want to publicize your donors or whatever, and you can say, okay, here are the volunteers and here's the skills they self-identified as part of it when we collected the form. So we're now tying it back again to say, we collect the data, we store the data, we do what we want with it, and then we can bring it back again for presentation purpose. So here's a real simple view, New Bay volunteers, that what their skills are and what they've chosen to do or offer up, and it's an example of how that can be done, and be done really without a lot of effort. This is from the Civi documentation. I figure I'll just grab that. You can use in Civi upcoming events listed. So you've got your events in Civi. You can do a view that says here's what they are. Click on this, and then register where you come from. Those kinds of things. Honor rolls of donors, committee lists, current members. Use your imagination. If you're putting data together with presentation capabilities, there's a good chance you can do it. This is a transition to a very specific example. It is not rocket science, but it's something that bedevils the nonprofit world, which is how do you capture data to demonstrate that you are in fact, doing what you claim to be doing and doing it effectively, doing well, outcomes. So many of you may have heard about outcomes. The Bill Gates quote of about 2 years ago, but the point is that you have to be able to measure it to improve it. It's using data to improve what you're doing, and certainly a huge factor in the nonprofit world. Nube received recently a grant from the Boston Foundation, and the purpose of the grant, small grant, the purpose of the grant was to demonstrate the use of open source applications, not something custom, but stuff that's already here, in this case Drupal and Civi together, as tools to do outcomes, to capture data that can be used to do outcomes. From the belief, I have it, and I'm promoting it to others, that people will capture this data if you give them tools that are effective for the purpose. That if they have to do something else, they have to collect the data with another process or go get it when it's time to grant, but if it's part of the natural flow of what they're doing, it can be very effective and basically have a huge impact, both in terms of their operational capabilities, but also in terms of donors and foundations' willingness to continue to support them. So the example I'm going to show you, the one that we're doing here, is for an organization in Boston called Metro Lacrosse. So they provide no-charge lacrosse programs for city kids for obvious reasons and lots of goals that go on. They have a multi-page registration form collecting medical information, emergency contact information, all of which, by the way, is being done through this Drupal web form with multiple contacts. So in addition to being able to connect to one contact, you can actually say, I've got 5 contacts in the city. I've got the participant and the parent 1, parent 2, emergency, Again, really interesting, powerful stuff. Custom fields to say we're going to collect medical information about these kids so that if they've got allergies, they can be known and provided. Well, we extended out in a simple way the registration form for these kids to say, okay, let's collect some outcomes related information. And what we decided to do was go with, what are the goals that the parent has for the child in the program? Let's ask the child what their goal is in terms of what's happening, what's your primary goal. Let's ask the parent to assess relative to the goal that they had. Maybe it's make friends, maybe it's do other kinds of things. How would you assess your child right now? Again, it's easy because they got a form in front of them, they click on the answer, it goes into the database associated with that contact. Not another spreadsheet or Google form or something else, it's all right there. So we're collecting the information as part of the registration process. Really no pain at all in terms of what's going on. One more half a page in terms of what's going on here. So what we then did is say, well, now we got the data in the database, we've used the form as we talked about, let's create a Drupal view to present that data, to use the data. So we set up a view, as I talked about a little bit earlier, and made this view accessible to coaches. So this is, now we're using Drupal's features for permissions and saying, okay, if you log in and you've got coaches permissions, custom permissions, you're going to be able to see this page. And what it is, it's an opportunity to say, okay, I'm a coach of the high school kids, I want to sort it according to that or filter it and then sort it or whatever, see the goals. So here I am, a coach, I'm working with a new group of kids, beginning of the season, they've all registered. What can I see? I can bring it up on my smartphone, I can look at it at home the night before, whatever. What are the goals for these kids? I've blanked out their names, obviously for privacy reasons and whatever. So you can say, okay, so Eileen wants to improve fitness from her parent and she wants to make friends as her goal, and her parent's goal is improve fitness, okay? Maybe it's, and so coach sees that and says, okay, Eileen seems to be a little reticent, I'm going to pair her up with a firecracker, for drills and things like that, and start taking this into account. I love this one. Gymnastics, put down her own goal, never give up. And so that's gold if you're a coach, right? You want to work with a kid and you got someone who says, this is what I care about. Because these kids are all going to show up at the field and they're going to be kind of like, they won't say anything and you can't draw them out or whatever. But this means that the people who have an impact at the right time can see the information and act upon it. What we're going to do at the end of the season is, guess what? We're going to email back out to those parents and say, by the way, when you registered, your goal for Eileen was, improve fitness or make friends or whatever it was. How did we do? know, what's your assessment now? So now we're starting to move it forward. We're going to do it with things like progression in school, okay? If one of the goals is to, you know, keep people busy or progress in school, we can start capturing that information with another program in terms of what's going on. So here's a case whereby the intelligent combination of the CRM and the CMS and these two spectacular products working together for no license fee, if we can put them in the hands of people and give them the support of what's going on, there's no limit to what's possible. And there's never give up. I'm not sure why this slide is in here. This is the New Bay slide. Oh, okay, so I got a few things I'm going to continue on with here. Actually, I think these are at the end of the presentation in terms of what's going on. There's capabilities that I'll speak to briefly. I don't know how am I doing my hour, maybe over already.
14 minutes.
I got 14 left? We'll have more time for questions. There's functionality with rules. So one of those modules with CiviCRM rules integration. And when I started going through the rules, they're amazing things. So you can say, okay, if a new activity is created in Civi, we're going to trigger some kind of a rule or an action, okay, whether it be updating a database or sending an email out or changing a contact value, whatever. And the list of rules that are in there are amazing. It could be register for an event. It could be, as I say, an activity is completed. It's a very long list. You can see I'm just showing a few of them here, and it goes way, way down. Really, really powerful rules examples. Again, imagination will determine how far you can go with it, but these tie back in to Drupal capabilities. The rule capability says you can build in a condition that from your data, if such and such a condition is met, then you do execute this rule, or you vary on something else in terms of what's going on. Create a Drupal account if you need to, or create a new entity. So here's a case where rules in Civi allow you to start doing things in Drupal that would otherwise maybe require a manual activity in terms of what's going on. So if the data in Civi can support, an activity, an action in Drupal, then you might in fact start automating things from end to end that who knows what they may be. I can't even possibly think about what they are. Organic groups, organic groups, before I get into this here, the organic groups, we've recently integrated them and found that we can actually, by creating a group in Civi, with a group in Civi, tie it to an organic group, and that organic group is dealing with permissions and roles in examples where Drupal is being used for forums, and whether or not someone is, if they're in a group in Civi, they can then be automatically enrolled in a forum in Drupal that they can participate in that is restricted with the right roles, and on and on and on in terms of what's going on. All recent stuff in terms of just discovering and beginning to use these kinds of things. So the vision, this disruptive, crazy vision, is that this really is, I won't say it's perfect, it can be perfect. It's the obvious thing that should happen, and it ought to disrupt an awful lot of things that are out there in the commercial world for nonprofits. A lot of pieces have to be put together. It's got to be done in a way that chasm doesn't look the way it does in terms of technical craziness, in terms of what's going on. It's got to look like a software product that comes out of the box and works. It's got to have the right kind of support. It's got to have first level support, second level support, things like that. That's our vision. I'm an enormous proponent of Civi and Drupal together, and I think we're just scratching the surface of what's going on. And if anybody's interested in being involved or whatever, I've got cards and interest in whatever. So, where's my water? Questions beyond what we've talked about already?
Is there, or are there good sizes for nonprofit organizations where this works the best or works well?
Good question. There are, one side of this is that Civi, I think the largest Civi installation is New York State Senate. They've got millions of contacts in the database. So they have proven that it can scale to millions of contacts over multiple, every Senate office in New York State, I guess, and with their constituents are in there. So there's some very, very large applications out there. The New Bay target, which is not exactly the question, but our target is organizations that are large enough to have a staff, so they're really doing things, they don't have to be a large staff, but there's full-time people working, up to the size of an organization that has a full-time IT person on staff. Not a help desk person, but someone who really, might deal with these kinds of applications and what have you. That's more pragmatic than not. I've got board members who have worked with some of the very large nonprofits and say they need it too, because they're killing themselves with Salesforce, and they're spending lots and lots, they may have the money and they're spending it. So I think these things apply. Certainly Drupal is not limited to by size of organization. And Civi has some rough edges. I do run into things whereby, you wish, the error message that came up, or why does this not work in this particular case we're done. So, but I don't think there's anything fundamental about the capabilities that would say a large organization or even a very large organization could not benefit or use.
What's the migration process look like from these like paid CRMs to Civi? For instance, I work at a nonprofit. We use the Razor's Edge, so I'd just be interested.
Yeah. So we've done a half a dozen of those migrations for the clients we're working with right now. We call them pilot clients, because we're proving the concept as well as learning what to do. Civi has really good, I keep saying these things, but it was one of the first areas I got involved with in using it was the import capabilities, and it's very smart in a variety of ways. Most often, the migration difficulties are a function of dirty data. They're coming, they haven't done a good job of data hygiene, and so I'd say 80% of the effort is, okay, let's use this opportunity to get rid of redundancies and bad records in, states in the city field and people that, just over time built these things up. But it's got a lot of functionality that once one uses it that is pretty smart about matching things up and turning it into a good database schema, which it has, by loading the organizations and then loading the individuals so that they can map to the organization. So it's quite good at that, but I won't trivialize the fact is that can be a challenge. But I've done a number of them, and they're sort of tricks of the trade, as you might imagine. Questions? Others? Mike?
Being one of the people who has used it before, to do development, I'm not sure how much people are clear on it, but all the stuff that David showed that's out of the box. You don't have to write a code. It's really impressive, the ability that you install this thing, you turn it on, you pick the modules you want, the capabilities, whether you want a Civi case or whatever, and it's just there. I mean, it's really impressive, and also the fact that with CiviCRM, they've implemented Drupal hooks. Unlike a lot of these other types, integration sort of, quote unquote modules, such that, when a user signs up to your site, and signs up to your Drupal site, then Civi just hooks right in, adds its fields, and away you go, basically. The Civi database is separate from the Drupal database, but Civi knows about the Drupal user, so that you can so your user logs in, and all this stuff is seamless to the user. But one of the things I wanted to ask you was, have you had the occasion to write code for any reason in doing one of these projects or integrations? And because it seems to me like the capability to do that is really powerful, and you get so much out of the box, and yet there's other things that you could do about it that I didn't have a chance to really scratch the surface with, and I was just wondering if you did.
Yeah, so the answer is the only code that has been written has been a function of custom themes in Drupal. Okay, so in terms of the Civi side of doing things of that type, do not have the capability to do that, have outsourced the Drupal theme side of it. Part of our goal that I'm committed to is not having custom code, okay? Even by virtue of extensions. Now that may not be possible to do that carry forward, but we're focused on let's do the things that you can do out of the box, because that's going to make a more scalable solution for the many thousands of organizations ultimately that could use it. So it's possible, just have not done it, and have consciously tried to not do it, and say how far can we go, as you mentioned, with just out of the box functionality, and haven't hit the walls that really are material yet, which is pretty fun.
Can you tell us any of the downsides?
Sure. No, I'm glad you asked that. The first downside is my ignorance, okay? Because I'm getting better at this, and but I've stumbled into a lot of things along the way. It's been an awesome learning experience, because I kind of feel like, having clawed my way across that chasm, kind of have an appreciation for what it is. terms of what's happening. I think the downside, again, the risk is, I certainly found this in Drupal with one of our clients, is that it is easy to get drawn into things that, maybe the incremental work may not be all that logical in terms of what's going on. If I talk about Civi, I love Civi, you can tell that in a lot of ways, and I use the rough edges part of it because there are things that sometimes just don't work, and then you have to scramble to figure out why, and then hopefully, insulate those kinds of things going forward. And the further you get into the, so for example, cases are relatively new or not as mature as certainly some of the other functionality. So it's in those areas that I've learned that you got to tread carefully and kind of, do your own QA, maybe more so, and then try to steer applications around those sharp edges or rough edges. Questions?
Not a particularly technical question, but how much of what you do is, if a nonprofit approaches you and needs help with all this stuff, like you were talking about the journey data, they're gonna need help with a pretty broad variety of things. They're probably not gonna know what the right setup is for them. Is that something that you try and tackle as well?
The answer is yes, as part of this pilot, acutely aware of, okay, what's the solution to that, which really is a labor solution. Okay, so having those skilled volunteers, technically skilled or trained in this capability. So the game plan is to work with organizations that are in the pro bono volunteer business, common impacts of the world and organizations like that, and enable them to do these things. I've come to realize that with the nonprofits, what we say to them is that we would like you to find somebody in your organization, or let's say the relative of, the spouse of, or the child of, or whatever, who is technically savvy, not coders necessarily, but isn't intimidated by Salesforce or whatever, and have that person be trained and be the first line of support. And then the idea for Nube would be the second level of support for that individual, because there's way too much hand-holding for a lot of nonprofits for a variety of reasons. We can all understand what they would be. But we're now at the point of, I believe that the technology is there, it works. Scaling is going to involve code that has to be written in order to do the scaling kinds of things. And then the next step is to say, okay, what do we need to do to virtualize a volunteer pool? I'm a believer that folks who wear hats when they have their pictures taken, like me, are approaching that time in their career where they have time, whether because they're empty nesters or retired or semi-retired or whatever, and would love to use their skills for this purpose. And we can deliver something that they can work at nights, on Saturdays, during the day, whatever, wherever they are, to help whoever they want to help. That's an enormous resource, just a question of figuring out how to bring it together and train it and use that. But I think labor is a big deal because of those kinds of things. The tools only don't build a house for you. But I use that example a lot in terms of Habitat for Humanity, in terms of people want to help, but someone's got to be the architect, someone's got to bring the the plans there, got to have the tools and supervise what's going on, and that's what I think we can do here.
Are there any reasons not to use this software for for-profit businesses?
There are no reasons not to. I'm glad you asked that. So. And a lot of people have asked me, why don't you do this for nonprofit businesses in terms of what's going on? And so I went and looked at Sugar CRM to say, how does Sugar CRM work with Drupal? And not nearly as well as Civi does, it turns out. There really isn't, that I've been able to find, and I've looked a lot in terms of what's going on. But there's no reason. You could use Civi. It's got some things that sort of, yell nonprofit about it when you look at it. It does have in that customization, though, you can remap any term you want. So you could probably go through it and change all the sort of things that, get rid of the lie bunch report, if you will, or do things like that. But as a CRM, I really think it's very competitive with an awful lot that I've seen out there. So the answer is not.
You just change donation to invoice or something.
Exactly, payment.
Billing.
It's just payment, call them payments, and that's easy to do. It's like a one-word change. Contribution to payment thing. So, but I don't know of a lot of people that have done that, and I can't say I know why.
Have you compared it to Red Hen?
A bit, only by virtue of indirect, meaning seeing some demos or whatever. I'm fairly confident that Red Hen is far, far less capable. Fully integrated with Drupal, but Civi's got 10 plus years of sort of
Right.
stuff
Okay.
going on. Red Hen, I think, is a fairly simple addition to, I mean, Drupal has a database. I mean, you can put your data into Drupal, it's just not as, usable in many ways. So I think Red Hen is going down that path, but from what I can tell, it's nowhere near as, doesn't have the breadth or depth that Civi does.
So in all of these systems, a lot of the time is in setting it up for the not-for-profit. So this is more or less about CiviCRM in particular, but just in the number of not-for-profits you've worked with. I mean, do you sort of feel you could give a initial setup that's maybe a little bit more than CiviCRM does that would meet, most ordinary nonprofits' needs, like much more quickly?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in the 80-20 rule, and I think it absolutely applies here, and it may be the 90-10 rule in terms of what's going on. And that's, so what I'm doing with this, through this pilot process, is trying to identify where are the points of integration that make sense and have the most leverage, such as what I've showed you here earlier. I'm not sure about organic groups integration, but, because I got into rabbit holes on that stuff. But, rabbit holes, I guess. That I think that a lot can be done that way. And so what I'm doing is maintaining an Amazon machine image, which is this, people say, that's a distribution, I don't care what you call it. It's basically a pre-configured set of things that you can replicate and say, boom, here it is, and you now have it all set up and you can log in and start doing things, change a few passwords and whatever, off you go. So I think that's very doable. CRMs, again, depending upon someone's ability, but with a volunteer or a helper or even someone on staff ready to run with it or use it, they go a lot. Several of the nonprofits I work with really, once they got up and running, started doing things. I said, wow, you did that. That's great. You figured it out, because they can just poke around and do things and Google it and find the documentation is okay. It's not fabulous, but it's okay, and there's a lot out there. And obviously there's forums and other ways of doing it, not nearly as well developed or as deep and rich as Drupal's, but a fair amount of stuff out there, and things that I never could have gotten this far without. I do, another sort of observation, again, from a guy who's come over from the dark side, right? About open source and the sharing side of it or whatever, is that I'm struck by when you find something online that solves your problem, you are in a mode, and it's happening more and more frequently, which is far better than if you called a vendor and got in the queue and they asked you whether or not you had a support agreement, and maybe they get back to you in an hour, maybe it'd be 2 days, but this sort of find it once, learn it once, share it forever via forums and Googling and whatever else is a much better way to do support once you get over the critical mass of what's out there. And again, it's not just cheaper, it's better. And it does make me a little crazy when I hear people say, are totally focused on the cheap part of it. Okay, that's fine, save all the money you can, but don't lose sight of the fact is it can be better. And it's a marketing challenge.
Quick follow-up on that. Have you submitted issues to the CiviCRM issue queues with the bugs you found or features you want, and so how has that experience gone?
Mixed, some success and some not. I'd say 90% of the need that I've had, I found because there was a thread, 1 to 5 years earlier, last month or whatever. So like everything, Civi has about 10,000, they're claiming now they've crossed over the 10,000 active sites. So that's a reasonable critical mass, and so things that are sort of reasonably mainstream, there's a good chance somebody else has hit it, if not recently, maybe in the past. Further go off into the weeds, the less so, but really think that, properly done, there's an opportunity to contribute heavily to this body of knowledge for the 10,000 and more.
But for bugs and new features?
Excuse me?
Bugs and new features, have you been the one to file that, or you always someone who's always beating you to filing a bug?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. So I started on the wrong side of this chasm, okay? So my technical knowledge is such that I'm not always sure whether it's a bug or just my mistake. So I probably am more reticent to say this is a bug, although I'm sure some of them are. I've tended to put things out there as a, hey, you know, is there a solution for this, and perhaps let others figure that out. But sometimes, you know, bug is really just understanding how the code works and saying, well, no, you're just configuring it wrong versus whatever. So
Just first to follow up on that a little bit, is, you know, like you said, the community isn't quite as big, so I found that the forums were really helpful, the CiviCRM forums. A lot of times if you ran into something, you know, people were pretty quick with being able to answer it one way or another, but a lot of times if you have an issue or something that you'd like to see that's very specific, it's what you'd expect, and you know, the development's gonna be driven by the demand, right? So I did find that, you know, to a certain extent, but again, you know, I thought the community from what I saw was great. They have basically a DrupalCon type of event every year.
right, just had it a couple weeks ago, yeah.
Yep, so, you know, they send out newsletters, things like that. It seems to be pretty good.
They do a lot with not a lot of resources. I mean, it's very,
Yeah.
very impressive
Yeah.
in that regard. A little scary as well in terms of those kinds of things, but really.
What's the background of the whole project? Where does it come from?
So I'm new to the table in terms of just understanding, but my understanding is that it was started by a couple of guys. One of them goes by the name Lobo, that's his last name, Donald Lobo, and then there's, I think, Dave Greenberg maybe, or two at least from the beginning. Their roots are very Drupal oriented, so they started kind of next door to Drupal or thinking about Drupal or whatever. I think that the core capabilities started with Drupal in mind, and that's why the Drupal integration. So there's an integration of Civi with WordPress and Joomla, not as good as the Drupal, partially I think because Drupal seems to be more amenable, not just by the architecture or what have you, and I think there's just the base and the more sophisticated base part of Civi is Drupal oriented, so Drupal seems to be better. But that's where it came from, and I think it is a community that is extraordinarily interested. It sort of takes community to the next level because they're focused on nonprofits. It's clearly not a, you know, we're going to make a lot of money off of this kind of mindset. So in that regard, I think extraordinarily interested in helping.
What's your suggestion on the best way for people to get started with it? I know there's a demo site, if I remember right, that they had out there.
Civi has a demo site, yes, there is out there. Yeah, someone asked me if I was going to do show how to install it. And I went through that pain a while ago in terms of what's going on and kind of solve that problem, says now we can replicate it. But yeah, that's one way, so much of it is not evident until you really get into it with a problem that you're trying to solve and say, okay, let's do that. I'm more than happy because I'm still, working down the learning curve. I benefit a lot by talking to people, asking what they're trying to do, helping if I can or whatever. So anybody here who is interested in whether it be a meeting or a phone call or has gotten to a point where I might be able to help, I'm more than happy to do that. But I wish I could say here's the checkboxes. That is a challenging part.
This might be a checkbox, but Pantheon has a Civi setup. You could just spin up a site and say you want it to be a Civi. Have you tried that?
Yes.
Just as an example, yes. And this may not be, I may be, a little too narrow-minded in this regard, but I've tried to preserve if we're going to scale this thing in a way that I think is possible, we have control over which applications are there and how they're integrated to be able to do that. So I've been sort of careful, and frankly, Amazon has given me all that I want in the sense of the platform hosting and being able to say, copy, 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 not as a one button type of thing, but reasonably close to that. And so I'm operating from a belief that with some coding done to basically scripting and things like that, that we could get to that path and really have closer to the bare bones that we're working from and not give up any, well, you can't do this. I mean, different example would have been, running on Acqui or whatever else, which really is Drupal.
The only
Obviously,
reason
Pantheon is
I
not just
mention
that,
it
yeah.
is anybody wanted to play could have
Oh,
a
sure.
site up
Yeah,
and running
yes.
in 5 minutes and play with it.
Yeah.
So there
it's
are
free until you make it
a
public.
few other companies that are somewhat involved with CiviCRM development that also offer hosted Civi. I don't think any of them actually start free, or at least like they might be a free trial, but none are like Are there any that you know of that offer a base level free?
I
But
don't know,
some
they're
that
cheap,
start
but
pretty cheap.
they're all inexpensive. I mean, when you get right down to it,
Compared
it's,
to
you know,
selling
your
it.
time is gonna be worth a heck of a lot more than whatever they charge you per month or what have you, in terms of what's going on. So, you know, it's, yeah, so I have not gone down that route, partially because of a, you know, a broader agenda perhaps, but,
If you want to keep your hands on the whole stack, how are you dealing with security? I mean, that means you have to keep on top of the patches to the operating system
Right.
and Apache and
Right.
MySQL and PHP and wobbly wobbly wobbly.
yeah. Yes, and so, you know, I rely upon Amazon in many ways for that, in terms of whether it be the operating system patches or Apache capabilities or whatever, you know, poodle bug kinds of stuff, and sort of saying, okay, we got to be on top of that. And certainly, you know, the broader vision of what we're trying to do would be to, in fact, you know, have top-notch security capabilities that can then be utilized and applied. I do believe, I'm a huge fan of Amazon, not because, I mean, not just because they're big in terms of what's going on, but I found that the functionality that I've needed and wanted and seems to be there, and then some, but I'm probably not ready to even take advantage of all of it. Although we've done a lot of things that when people have looked at, I've had some security people look at what we're doing, and they were kind of impressed in terms of, you know, locking down IP addresses for certain kinds of things, and, you know, a bunch of things that you generally want to do and whatever. But it is a requirement
No,
for
it's
sure.
not that I'm worried that what you have
Yeah.
isn't
It never
storing.
stops.
It's never stops.
Yeah. And
Part of it.
Yeah, and so one of my goals is to raise money from the venture community, not for profit reasons, but for, you know, the right reasons, and be able to build a core staff of people that will pay attention to that. That's
Right.
things that are well beyond what I'm able to do, either with hours or skills or what have you.
Sort of related to that, like in terms of the data that's housed in some of the systems, you know, like it's taking payments, and it's also potentially storing private health information. Like, are there guidelines for configuring CiviCRM to maintain HIPAA or PCI compliance?
Okay, so on the PCI side, so for payments, it's all being that's all passed through to the payment processors. So they're the PCI people in terms of doing that. So there's nothing in the Civi database that would be the pure PCI stuff, you know, bank accounts, credit cards, you know, those kinds of things. Then you start moving into other categories of what's a birth date, you know, other, you know, personally identifiable information in terms of what's going on, which has different requirements there. And even HIPAA, you know, not to say that we're not HIPAA compliant, but HIPAA is very fuzzy in terms of what exactly it's sort of, you know, so for example, the medical information for those kids, I've gotten both sides of it from, you know, is the allergies considered HIPAA or not in terms of what's happening there and what are the requirements for handling that. I'd say in most of the cases the organization I'm working with are actually improving their security, but not necessarily going to where, you know, Harvard Medical School is going, or other organizations that are doing, you know, who have HIPAA compliance. But it's a, I have looked into, and there is, you know, there are capabilities, although they're not sort of check-a-box capabilities for encrypting field level capabilities, and so that's an area of investigation, so that one ought to be able to say, hey, check this box, and there's going to be field level encryption. But then the same people will say, yeah, but if you got a password to get into the account, you can still get it back out again. So it's not even clear that you know, gets you another level or something.
For scaling up, have you considered doing a multi-site, and would that even work with Civi because you have to have like 2 databases, right?
The answer is I don't know. I don't know. You know, what I've done thus far, and again, this in part reflects, you know, my own abilities in terms of what's doing is, and I've gone down the path, and it seems to have worked so far, is to say each organization has their own instance in Amazon. So there's an argument for saying they're completely isolated from each other on all fronts in terms of what's going on, which they are in terms of that, but it may be sacrificing, you know, multi-site functionality I honestly don't know where Civi fits in that regard. I don't know that there's an equivalent to what you can do with Drupal for Civi in that sense, but have not gone down that path.
What about Drupal 8? Is Civi dealing with it?
Yes, and conceptually in terms of what's going on, but I don't know that there's a, an urgency within the client base, or certainly I'm not eager to say, gotta have Drupal 8. There's plenty for us to work with 7, and again, addressing mainstream kinds of things.
Just want to say, when I installed Civi first 7 years ago, maybe now, Lobo was the lead developer at the time. I think helped me directly with that install. So I don't know if that level is done that for all 10,000 sites that have installed it since, but the level of support from the top was fantastic, and I think they're originally grant funded a lot. They had some serious foundation support that allowed them to very strategically say, all right, this is the set of what we're gonna work on next. And then they started surveying their community, okay, what should work on next? And now they are doing fundraisers from the community on what we should work on next. So I'm just curious. Anyhow, it looks
He's
like
still
they're-
very involved in the
functionality
forums.
Doubled every 6 months. So I'm just curious, is there a piece you see missing, and is that on their battle plan, or what is next on the implementation plan?
Yeah, I'm not the best person to speak to what their implementation plan is, and I'm, there are, if I have my wish list, I would probably, the question I get probably more than anything is financial, accounting kinds of capabilities. If we were to sort of move from CMS and CRM, well, what else is next? They're addressing that with QuickBooks integration, and to be honest, I'm not sure if I was in their shoes or anybody's, I'd want to go down that path anyway. QuickBooks is fine, and there's integration points and whatever. What I've been struck by with the integration we've talked about is how many of the sort of front office capabilities, when you take email, website, and database, how much of the sort of externally facing capabilities that a nonprofit wants to have. And so I'm quite happy to keep mining that, kind of maintaining but we could do all these other things as sort of a down the road part of the vision, and the kinds of things that sometimes helps you raise money from people who really buy into it. But I think that there's just so much that can be done in learning more every day.
Time for one more question?
I guess, yeah, I'm here, so I'll
The
stop.
mail piece, and how do you integrate the sending of mail from the Amazon instance? I mean, you're not.
Good question, yeah. So there's an SMTP mail capability. I have zeroed in on using Elastic Mail, whatever it's called, as the SMTP provider, because they're low cost, they do a really nice job. And so I've sort of made that part of the standard setup, and just say you need a SMTP account, because
You have to go set up this account.
yeah, I tried the Amazon SES capabilities, which does have SMTP mail in it, and I was not successful getting it to work. I've also heard a lot of people say that you really have, that there are some blocking issues that are hard to deal with. So, but we're trying to do, as part of this configuration, which can drive people crazy, getting dedicated IP addresses for outbound email, getting the, GoDaddy or whoever the domain, registration setup is. Those things all have to be done because they're all part of that chasm too. They may not be quite as cryptic as the stuff there, but to say those things can't be just sort of left to, oh, by the way, because people will die and they'll go right back to constant contact or suffer with that.
That's
Yeah.
one of the most
Yeah.
always there chasms, is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
gap between email.
I came from the email world, and so I'm very sensitive to that. And I think we've actually got, Elastic Email does, I think, a good job, and they do have dedicated IPs and the right kinds of things, and they're progressing nicely in terms of their capabilities.
And it's
It's an Amazon
Elastic
service.
email?
It's
from
Elastic
Amazon?
Email. It's either Elastic Mail, I think it's Elastic Email, one word.
And it's an Amazon product.
No, I'm sorry,
it's
no,
not.
no, it's a third-party
Separate-
company.
that's right.
Yeah, so you
Sorry,
can
separate
Google the
system.
company, and they really have minimal upfront costs, so
Great.
it's cheap and easy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, appreciate the attention. And the applause.